Well, it's my privilege to introduce and do the interviews tonight. I'm Kitty Ledbetter, and who I'm introducing tonight I've known for a really long time. I've known him since the second grade. We went to Hickory Hills, and then we went to Glendale, and Pat was playing trumpet in my junior high school band. And I've known him the rest of my life, even though he's been gone. We've pretty much kept in touch, so I'm really proud and excited to introduce him. He started music left Springfield in 1978 to go to Horizons East, went to Nashville, and he's been in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Bo Brown, always grand staging.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bo Brown.
I know. But when he left in 1978 for a big career in Nashville and country music, and I'll let him tell you about that. But his first band was in high school in Springfield, Missouri, at Glendale High School. He was in Papa John. So I'll let him talk more about that. Here is Pat Jackson.
Thanks. Actually, I want to point out, we didn't talk about this, but one of my first bands, too, was the SMSU Independent Marching Band.
I remember that.
Remember that? Yeah, it was a bunch of misfits that got together and marched in that. It was fun, and we won't talk about details, but let's just say we had a good time. Most of us don't remember it, but we're pretty sure we were there. We were told we were. You were there, weren't you, Bo? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's start in with a list of questions that have been dictated to me by Pat. Why did you first start to play music?
That's a good question. I've always liked music. I used to sing around the house a lot as a kid, and I drove my folks nuts because I was always doing. All you musicians, I'm sure you started out doing stuff like that. You were always playing some sort of rhythm in your head, and so I did that a lot. And so I decided to play the trumpet. I really, to this day, don't know why I chose the trumpet, but it turns out it was a lot easier to carry around than a bass, an upright bass. But anyway, so I played in the school band until my freshman year in high school, and it was a mutual agreement between me and the conductor of the band that I should probably go elsewhere because I know this is going to be hard for those of you who know me to believe, but I was kind of a smart aleck in high school, and I think the band conductor and I had differences of opinion, shall we say. So I started realizing that it was about the time the Beatles hit the airwaves, and I remember being in my driveway. I don't even think I was old enough to drive. I was probably with my brother because I tried to hang around with him all the time. But we heard the Beatles, and I went, wow, what is that? And I just fell in love with the Beatles. And so my mom, who worked at Shady Inn for 30 years, and Mr. Hoover, who used to own, they used to like to go out there and eat, and he one time had an old F-hole Gibson guitar that she, after several drinks on his part, she was able to talk him out of it for a ridiculously low price. And she brought it home to me. And I thought, wow, what a cool guitar. I knew it was a really good guitar, but I didn't know how good it was. So I played that for a little while, took a couple of lessons, and then I had to get an electric guitar. And she sold, you guys might want to close your ears when I say this, she sold that old Gibson guitar to one of her workmates for her son for $50. Mm. Yeah, I know, me too. I tried to find out what happened to that guitar, and she finally remembered who she had sold it to, and she went to her and asked her, and she said, oh, he destroyed that guitar years ago. And so that was my first cool guitar, but I really didn't know it. So I got an old, it was a Standell amp, I think, and a Kent guitar, red Kent guitar. And so I started banging around with some friends around the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, Shelley Apostle here, when we were kids, she lived on one street over from me, and her mom was the coolest mom in the neighborhood. And so we went over there, and I think we actually set up in your garage, didn't we, and played music? in the living room, better yet. So we just loved to go over there because her mom was, like I said, the coolest one in the neighborhood. So we started banging around some more. My first real band in high school was Papa John. And so I'm going to move back a little bit so I can actually see you. And that band was actually pretty good. We were about the same time as Bubble. Anybody remember the band Bubble? Yeah. Oh, there's a Bubble fan. And we shared a rehearsal house. The house, it was down by James River, I think. And anyway, I can't remember the name of it. So we kind of cross-pollinated. And I was more I was the singer, and I sang all the love ballads and the nice stuff. But then Jimmy Wonderly left Bubble, and we got him in our band. And of course, Jimmy, most of you remember Jimmy Wonderly, and he was a front man extreme. And he would do all the rock and roll stuff. So as I was telling somebody earlier, my tenure with that band didn't last much longer after that. So then it just kind of became a free-for-all. You know, different people would play together. We all used to go down and sneak in and see Benny Mahan. Benny Mahan was a guy that we all looked up to, because if you never heard Benny back in his heyday, this guy was, to this day, one of the best singers I ever heard in my life. And so we would sneak in to listen to those guys.
When did you know that you wanted to be a professional musician?
I think when I realized that girls liked guys in a band, so that was a real good catalyst for me. That's horrible, isn't it?
How did that work out?
Sometimes good, sometimes not so good.
So when did you start thinking that you were a professional musician?
That's a good question. I think we talked about this today. I don't know that I ever one day just had an epiphany and said, I'm going to be a professional musician. But I knew it was fun to do. I had a crazy neighbor that his name was Billy Mason, and he used to have all of this gear set up in his garage. And all of us junior high school kids just thought that was the coolest thing. But this guy couldn't play a lick. I mean, he just, you know, he turned every amp he had in that garage up as loud as it would go, and just would, you know, be playing all these. So that was the first thing that told me that that's pretty cool to have all that gear. And so I got myself a Fender. What was the lower end Fender guitar back in those days? The Mustang. I got a red Mustang, and got me a little bigger amp, and just started playing more. Ended up playing down at Kimberling City, and that's when I became a bass player, because our bass player quit, and we couldn't find another bass player. But I always tell people I'm the world's worst guitar player. I could play chords and stuff, but the first real lick. I learned the guitar solo on Secret Agent Man, because it was a single, ding, 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 ding. Yeah. But anyway, so I was the guitar player. So this guy, I was telling somebody this story earlier, had an old guitar, old bass, and he said, Pat, he said, if you're going to play bass, he said, I got an old bass at the house you could use until you find one. I said, okay. He brought it in, and by this time I knew a little more about guitars. I'm just going to tell you this, and you guys will understand. It was a 1957 Fender P bass. And I knew exactly what he had. And I said, so Paul, John, do you want to sell this? He said, oh, Pat, I don't know, man. He said, this guy owed me $100, and he gave me this guitar in display, so I'd have to get $100 out of it. I went, really? Well, I happened to have $100 at that time, so I ran out to my car and got the checkbook. And I played that bass up until several years ago. I was trying to save my first marriage. She was a classical violinist, and I wanted a nice guitar. So I traded my P bass in for a Martin HD 28. And then Fender guitars went through the roof.
So you started as a trumpet player.
Yes.
Then you went to a guitar player, and then you went to a bass player. What made you make those changes to be a bass player?
To make a living. Mostly. I found out I had a penchant for bass. I heard bass lines, and I learned one of the early things that you have to learn as a bass player is the bass player and the drums are the rhythm section. I heard Wynton Marsalis say years ago, he said, you can have the best guitar player, the best keyboard player, the best horns, but if the rhythm section ain't happening, the band ain't happening. And if you listen to that, if you listen to the radio, you listen to, working in the studio in Nashville, you always, as a bass player, I always wanted the kick drum in my ear. And when sound guys on the road would say, what do you need in your monitor? I said, I need my vocal, I need the lead vocal, and I want the bass drum right up my butt, because that's where I had to live. And that's the best thing I could say. And I had a lot of drummers tell me I was one of the first bass players that actually understood that concept. And I don't know why, I just did.
Well, I happen to know from experience with you that you have fine vocals too. And so it wasn't just your bass playing, it was your vocals.
No.
You really are a great singer.
Thank you.
And playing with the bass made you a prime.
Singing bass players aren't that normal. I mean, literally, look at me. I'm not that normal. But seriously, having a bass player who can not only sing lead, but can sing whatever parts left over, that kept me working as much as anything.
Well, I also know that since you left in 1978, you experienced what you've called the daredevil effect. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sort of. The Daredevils, of course, were the big deal back there. They still are around here. I mean, it's, and as a matter of fact, Supe and I were talking about this one time, that he was in the SMSU Independent Marching Band. And so that's kind of when I first got to know Supe. And so we, but they were, here's a little rock and roll country band that made it, that were making records and making hits. And they were just this ragtag bunch of hippies and having a great time playing, writing some great songs. And that was kind of the epitome. Of course, we had Granny's Bathwater, which musically speaking, those guys were without parallel, I think, around here. It was just really fun to go see those guys play. If you never saw Granny's in their heyday, it was astounding.
Well, you mentioned the rock and roll country genre. What do you like to play most?
I like to play good music. My musical tastes are pretty eclectic. I think there's good music in any genre. Dudley Murphy and Deanie introduced me to bluegrass. I'd listened to bluegrass a lot. I liked bluegrass, but they were looking for a bass player, and I'd never played upright bass in my life. And I called Dudley. I'd met him. I can't even remember how. And I said, "Hey, give me a tape of one of your shows and a bass. And a week." And I said, "I would like to audition for your band." Well, I was living with JR at the time, and he had an old 5-string K. So I got his 5-string K out, and of course JR is a music teacher. He helped me a lot and just learned how to play bass in a week. And then I got, and those of you who remember, County Line was probably the bluegrass band here at that time. Mm-hmm. And Deanie's here with us tonight. Thank you for coming, Deanie.
And we might add, not just here, but lots of places in the Midwest. Everyone knew Dudley and Deanie and Dudley. So you left in 1978. Could you give us sort of a timeline and a list of the people that you played with after you left Springfield?
Sure. Well, I couldn't hold a job, but when I left here, actually, my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, we decided, I said, I don't want to be playing bars the rest of my life. So my sister lived out in Denver. So I said, let's go out to Denver and see what's shaking out there. So we did. We drove across Kansas and got to Denver. And this was back when they had ads in the newspaper. And they said they were looking for a singing bass player at the Zanzibar, which was one of the largest bars in Denver. So I went out, I called them and got on their list and went out and auditioned for the Zanzibar. And I got the gig. They wanted me to come because they had me sing parts and sing a couple of leads and play some stuff and just read some charts. And then Jan and I got to talking. I said, I don't really want to move 800 miles away and just do the same thing. The next day, Craig White, many of you know Craig, he was Bob White's son who was on the Jubilee, so you know all about that. Craig was one of my best friends growing up, and he called me out in Denver, and he said, hey, Pat, Speedy Haworth is out there working with a woman named Bonnie Nelson, and they need a bass player. I said, cool. So I called up Speedy. He gave me the number, and of course that was way before cell phones. And so I called Speedy, and I said, Speed, I hear you guys need a singing bass player. And I had known Speedy a little bit as a kid. I mean, I was, Bob, and I would hang around with the family, so I knew all of them pretty well. And Speedy, of course, to him, in his mind, he was, I was still just a little kid, but I was 26 at the time, and so he said, yeah, we do. And I said, well, do you need me to come over and audition? He said, nah, Craig vouched for you, so I know you can play. So that's how I went to work for them. And so I brought Jan back over here to Springfield and dropped her off, and I went back out, and we had several gigs booked around the western area right there close to Denver. And so then we played somewhere up around St. Louis, I think, and they dropped me off in the bus. We made arrangements. They dropped me off at a truck stop in Kansas City so I could get married. And and we won't talk about that. But so we got married, and then we climbed in the car and went back to Denver. And when I got back, I called Speedy, and I said, what's going on? And he said, do you have your passport? And I said, for Des Moines? Because I knew we were going to Des Moines sometime, and I said, no, I don't have a passport. And so he said, well, we got to get you one. We're going to Germany. Okay. So Bonnie Nelson's boyfriend / road crew, he was a sales rep for these fancy boots. I can't even remember the name of it now. Tony Lama boots. So he got me, somehow he rammed it through and got my passport. And so we went to Germany, and we were booked to play the first nationally televised country music show in Germany. And it was Freddie Quinn was the star of the show, very, very well-known singer in Germany, a la Perry Como. He was one of those guys. But he was very well-known, spoke perfect English. And I remember that John Conley and the guy that did 6 Days on the Road.
Dave Dudley.
Dave Dudley. I had that problem this afternoon, didn't I? And I took a nap, but so there were several people on there that we knew. And when we came in, and we'd flown all night in this bar, well, actually, that back in those days, they did. The 747s had a bar upstairs for first class passengers. So Bonnie was in first class, and she came back and got us, and we went up there and drank all the way across the Atlantic. And so we get to Germany, and I get out, and I'm both hungover and jet lagged, and I see all these guys with submachine guns walking around the airport, and I went, phew. So we walk into where the studio was, and I hear this voice. It's going, see them tumbling down. And I looked up there, and I said, my God, that's Festus. And it was Festus, the guy that played Festus. I didn't know that he was one of the original Sons of the Pioneers.
Ken Curtis.
Ken Curtis sang his butt off. And so we had a great time. We were there for a week, and we did this show, and we came home and did Des Moines and some other gigs that we had, and then we moved to Nashville. And I was always told not to move to Nashville unless you had a gig. That was good advice. So I had a gig, but there was a group on there called the Drifting Cowboys, which was Hank Williams Sr.'s band. And they had just lost their bass player. And so I decided my goal, because Bonnie was a little tough to sing with, and I told my wife, I said, I'm going to get a job with those guys. And so I started. Hillis Buttram had been Hank's bass player. And so I found out where he had an office down on Music Row. He and Marty Robinson had a a publishing company. He was still doing that sort of thing. He was producing some. And Hillis was this old cowboy from northern Tennessee. And I can still see him now. He would be sitting there at his desk with his feet up on it, and he'd always have a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and a cup of coffee in his hand, kind of like Mom used to, you know. So he kind of became my mentor. When I got a call for a session or something, he would always say, "That guy's okay," or "Get your money up front," that sort of thing. So he really helped me navigate that time. He hired me on my first master session, and the master sessions in Nashville at that time, I think we're paying about $300 for a 3-hour session, which was great. But there were also a lot of scab sessions around town, and those, I mean, you know, as a musician, I didn't know any musicians who were turning down scab sessions, because you could go in and
What is a scab session?
A scab session is a non-union session that does not go through the union. You don't pay the union dues. I was a member of the union here, and then when we got there, after a short time, I joined the Nashville local. And then we, where was I going with that? Session work, yeah. So he called me, and it was a CBS session, and it was great. I mean, there were some of the Pig Robbins. Anybody remember that name, Pig Robbins? Great piano player. Sonny Garish. Some of these guys that were the A team at that time. Nashville always had that kind of thing. You know, and one of the things that I noticed was that the A team was always changing. People, you know, some hot dog would come to town, and he would start playing all these sessions, and some other hot dog would come and start producing all these sessions. So I learned quickly from both the Drifting Cowboys and doing sessions that the longevity of a musician in Nashville is not great. You know, you can make a living at it, but, you know, you're going to be back to playing honky-tonks. And I had a friend of mine, a guitar player. He played with Barbara Mandrell for a long time. And he said, only in Nashville could you be walking down a staircase with Barbara Mandrell singing a duet, and the next week you're playing a honky-tonk in Dixon, Tennessee. And that was the reality of the music business. So it's not all lights and glamour, but you love it. You guys that are musicians understand this. Once you become a musician, you're a musician. You know, you can't get it out of your blood. And so it's, I still love to play music. I got to play with one of the best banjo players in the world right there, and some great Texas players, and even Bo. And I've known Bo for a very long time, so I can.
So it was hard to find a gig in Nashville. Is that what you're saying?
No.
A recording gig.
Well, it's really funny, because back in those days, the old Hall of Fame Motor Inn was right next to the Hall of Fame. And so that's where everybody went in the morning and drank coffee. And I got more sessions just sitting there getting to know some of these guys. Harold Shedd, who later produced Alabama, he had a little studio on Music Row, and I got to know him. And if he saw me in there, he'd say, "Hey, Pat, I got a 10 o'clock tomorrow. Are you available?" And you'd say, "Sure." You know, I always had my bass in the car, just ready for a session. So, you know, I got pretty lucky. I had a couple of pretty decent years as a session player. But again, it's feast or famine. And go ahead.
So when did you start playing with the Drifting Cowboys, and how long did you play with them?
I came back from Germany and immediately started harassing Hillis to try to get in the band. And it didn't take them long, and they hired me. And here I am, a 26-year-old long-haired guy. I've got a picture of me at the Minnesota State Fair with them, and they're all in their white suits and their cowboy hats, and they look very proper. And I'm standing back there in my bell-bottoms and long hair. It looks pretty funny, but they loved me. And I learned a lot from them. Like I said, they were the ones that really taught me, because here they were guys my age now, still beating their heads on the road out there, just barely eking out a living. And I said, I don't want to be doing that, you know, because it's harder to do that if you're just a sideman. If you're just a sideman, you've got to keep hustling. You know, guys I know that are still doing the music business full time, who are my age, in their 70s, are still out there looking for the next gig. And that's part of the deal. And some guys are better at that than I was. So,
Who was in the Drifting Cowboys at that time?
well, it was actually the four guys that first went on the Opry stage with Hank the first time he played the Opry. It was Hillis Butler played bass. Bob McNett was on guitar. He had moved up from the hayride, the Louisiana hayride with Hank. Don Helms. If you're a musicologist, you'll recognize that name. Don Helms was one of those guys, especially when I moved to town. You'd tell a steel player in the studio, play me some Don Helms licks. Don Helms was also one of the funniest human beings I have ever met in my life. But he called those, if you listen to a Hank record and you'll hear those steel, he called them his dirls. And some of the stuff he did, I'm not going to share with you here, but just funny stuff that when we'd get on the bus, he would set. Bob McNett was one of the kindest humans I ever knew. He lived in Pennsylvania, and he and I roomed together. So when we'd have a few days in between gigs, he would come and stay at my house, and it was not unusual for us to get a bottle of Jack Daniels and sit in my living room and play acoustic guitars until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And it was great because he taught me all these old country songs, and I said I got a PhD in country music that year, and Jerry Rivers was the fiddle player.
So do you think that's a pivotal moment in your career?
Absolutely. We I loved we did a double album of all Hank tunes. That was cool. We did it at the guy that produced it owned the studio. So we wouldn't go into the studio until about 10 o'clock at night because that was when he wasn't booking the studio, so he wasn't making money. So we would go in and play from about 10 o'clock and 10 p.m. until about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. But we had a great time. And these guys were all in their 50s and 60s at the time. And I couldn't imagine doing that now. I mean, 9 or 10 o'clock, buddy, I'm in bed. And so any of you who are my age understand that. And most of us men in here have, how many men had a nap this afternoon? Not very many. I'm surprised.
There's something wrong with you, I guess.
I love naps. You did you? Oh, well, I'm sorry, man.
So how long did you work for the?
I worked with them for a year. We played some cool stuff. I mean, we played a couple of shows with the Texas Playboys. That was fun. I was telling you this afternoon about we played a place that was about 60 miles south of New Orleans, down into the.
You mean in the ocean?
Almost, yeah. Well, they told us it was called the Crazy Cajun, and it was. But this will tell you how generations are a little different. I love Western swing. And so I used to do Miles and Miles of Texas, which I thought Ray Benson wrote. Do you remember the guy's name that wrote it?
No, but
Okay.
it was a long time before.
It was in 61. But I thought that Ray Benson, because those guys had never heard it. So they wanted me to sing a song. So I said, let's do Miles and Miles of Texas in C. And Helms went. And I just leaned over to him and I said, Don, kick off driving nails in my coffin. And we'll be fine. And that's what he did. So you can get around those things. And see, I can just look at Alan when we're playing together. I said, kick it off, Alan, and he's the guy. I'm sorry, Alan, I don't mean to. I know how easily you embarrass.
So what other artists in Nashville did you work with?
Probably the most fun band I worked with Billy Dean off and on for about 6 years before he had his record deal. And we had a crazy band that had two rules. The first one was the first guy that mentioned rehearsal was fired. The second one was whoever booked the gig was the band leader. You've played in those bands, haven't you? Yeah. So, and we had a great time, and it was a good band. We had to, Billy was great fun to sing with. I did most of the drummer sang a little bit. The keyboard player didn't sing. But that band was a fun band. We went just around a lot, around Nashville, and we went to Florida a couple of times. Billy was from there, got us some gigs down there. So yeah, that was. So I went, but actually I forgot the other one. There was another one, wasn't there?
BR549?
BR549. No, I met that guy. I wish I should have looked up his name. But we all, over at Supe's house, a lot of times we get together, and he'll build a big fire in his in the thing, and we'll just play. He gets a bunch of old guys over there and just play music. And so we're sitting there and we're talking, and Supe said something to this guy, and he said, are you guys going out soon? And the guy goes, yeah, I think we're leaving next week. And so he and I are sitting right across from each other, and I said, oh, who do you play with? And he said, Dylan. And I looked at him and I said, Bob Dylan? And he said, yeah. And I went, wow. So it was fun. And there was a band around BR549, it was a real eclectic sort of band that were real popular, and he was in that band. It was a trio that played down on Lower Broad for years.
How did you meet Don King?
My friend Bobby Randall, who, if you remember Sawyer Brown, Bobby was the original tall, skinny guitar player that had curly hair. He called me up and he said, listen, man, I've got a new friend of mine that's just gotten a deal on Decca, which was owned by CBS. He said, we're putting a band together. He said, you want to come play with us? I said, okay, I'll try it. So I went, and it worked pretty well. He had just cut his first album, and so CBS brought in a guy from New York, this was weird, to stage the show, to teach us how to be on stage. And I mean, I learned a lot of tricks that I'd never learned before, but it was, and then we rehearsed our brains out. That was one of the better bands because it was so well rehearsed. All the vocal parts were broken down and rehearsed, and the drummer and I both had really good falsettos. We both went through puberty with the Beach Boys, and so we always got the girl parts off of the record. We would do these real wispy, those sorts of things, and the band was spot on. But Don's dad was an accountant. They had moved down from Iowa, and he was an accountant. And he thought suddenly his son having a record deal, he was a road manager, and he was a sound mixer, and he wasn't. But so we went out on the road, and back in the 80s, that's when they had a lot of package shows. So I'll never forget, we were going to upstate New York, and the Oak Ridge Boys were one of the hottest things on the radio at the time. And we pull in, and we're opening for them. And so their crew has their stage all set up, and we were the opening act. The opening act gets what's left over. So we walk in, and Don's dad, I'm right behind him, and Bobby was behind me. We're walking in, and he says to their stage manager, he said, where's our drum riser? And the guy looked at him and said, what? He said, we have a rider. We have a drum riser. He said, if we don't get a drum riser, we're going back to Nashville. And I turned around to Bobby. I said, don't unload anything, guys. I think we're going home. But anyway, somehow he got the drum riser. And so they had to move some of their gear around and give us a place. But by the time we got back to Nashville, everybody in town knew it. And so but we played some really cool shows. I remember we were opening, they would usually have about 3 acts. We were opening for Conway. And Conway was really a short man. I'd say he was 5'6" or 5'7".
About Conway Twitty?
Conway Twitty, yeah. Can't we just use first names here, kid?
You could for some people.
But anyway, so I'm standing, I got to, you get to know those people. And so we're just standing there, we're just chatting. And he had a wireless mic, which was unusual in those days. And he had this big guy that they call Pork Chop, who was his drummer. And, the band would come out and play a couple of songs. And then he did this drum roll, and he said, now, ladies and gentlemen, Conway Twitty. Conway's standing as close as you are to me, and he said, excuse me, I got to go to work. And he goes, hello, darling. And every woman in that place just fell over. And but you find out, Dwayne Allen, the first night we were with the Oaks, even after the drum riser debacle, he walked up to me backstage, and I'm just a side man. He said, hey, I'm Dwayne Allen. And I found those guys, if they were a big star, they were usually much nicer than the ones who thought they were the star. So.
Which person Who did you meet that you were most enamored with, that you really admired?
Probably Chet. Yeah, that was kind of a big deal. Craig was in town, and of course, his mom, I remember his mom as a kid always talking about Chet, and his wife would sit around when they were doing the Jubilee, and they would be playing cards. And he said Chet always had that guitar in his hand. He was always playing. He was one of the kindest, most gentle men that I have ever met in my life. Very soft-spoken, very unassuming, and it was just, yeah. And there's a lot of those guys around. You don't even realize that they're. Can I tell my Garth Brooks story?
Of course.
I was playing with actually Billy Dean was in the band, and Brent. I didn't follow your orders and jot it down. It'll come to me because I remembered.
They probably understand.
He's a songwriter. He co-wrote "If Tomorrow Never Comes" and "Ain't Going Down Till the Sun Comes Up." But we were going. I think we got another gig with Billy, and so we were Billy and I think one other guy from our band was playing in the band. So he had to get some subs, and he said, "Listen, I've been writing with this new guy, just moved here from Oklahoma, and he could really use a gig. He's just struggling to make ends meet." He said, "Can you leave your amp?" He said, "I've got a bass at the house." He said, "And I'll bring it." And I said, "Okay." So the next weekend I got back, and he said, "Well," he told me, he said, he told me he wasn't much of a bass player. And so I come back the next weekend, and he said, "Well, he wasn't kidding. Can't play bass." So, when I tell people that Garth Brooks subbed for me, that's, you have to be careful that it doesn't sound like you're dropping names, but it happens. So.
Well, tell us about your experience with Woody P. Snow.
Woody P. I knew him as Jay Stevens when he was on KICK. They're not W here, are they? KICK. He was you probably all remember Woody when he was still Jay Stevens. One of the revolving door of guitar players we had down at the Kimberling City. Well, I'll just name him. It was Dean Billingsley. It was Johnny Frischkorn. Does anybody remember that name, Johnny Frischkorn? Johnny Frischkorn was one of those guitar players that all of us, when we heard him play the first time, we just went, how does he know that many chords? I mean, this guy played, he would play 18 chords in one bar of the song. But he came down and played with us. Dean Billingsley, did I say that already? So we couldn't, after I started playing bass, maybe that was the reason. But we kept having these new guitar players. And so one of the guitar players, Dane Allen, he came to me. Dane Allen, he and his wife were both music teachers. And Dane told me one night, he said, "Listen, I've got this friend that's writing songs, and he's got this new song he wants to pitch, and so we need to go in and help him cut a demo." So we did Rocky. You all remember that song he had? I think it was a number 1 record, but we played on the demo, and I doubt that Woody would remember that. Would he remember? Did he? Did he mention me? Dang. Okay.
So what year did you start working for Middle Tennessee State University, and how did you get that job?
Another weird story. Hillis Buttram with the Drifting Cowboys, like I said, was kind of my mentor. He owned all of the old Ernest Tubb shows from the 60s, and he was wanting to set up a duplication house and an editing suite on Music Row. He had an office there. So I had come, my wife was pregnant, so I decided, I really need to get off the road. Plus, in Nashville at that time, I assume they still do it, if they tried to call you for a session and you were on the road, they'd say, "Oh, he's a session guy," or the opposite, "Oh, he's a studio guy." So that was another thing. I was having some success at doing that, and so I thought staying in town would be better. But Hillis set up this duplicating house, and one of the buddy of his that helped him set it up, they had an old 3/4 inch just a single cuts only. If you know anything about video, and I know you do, it was a cuts only. You couldn't do dissolves and all that stuff. But he had all of these old Ernest Tubb shows, and so I put all these shows together of like Willie Nelson back when he was wearing a cardigan and slicking his hair back and leaning on a rail fence singing Crazy. Some of Ernest's band, later had several hits. So I learned to edit video doing that. And if I guess maybe Al Gore had invented the internet by then, but it thank you for getting that. But it wasn't that widely used. If it had, Hillis would have made a fortune. But we cut all these shows together and started selling them. And he did okay. So then a friend of mine told me, I was living in Murfreesboro, which is about 25 miles south of Nashville. And he said, hey, there's an opening over at MTSU for a video guy. I said, really? He said, you ought to go see about it. I said, okay. So I did. And I went in, and the guy that hired me, I was 31. I had a new baby by then. And so all these other guys were just freshly out of college. And I told him, I said, most of my background is in post-production. So, and I'd always been kind of an amateur photographer. I knew about, getting the shot correct, giving look space. And so he hired me because I was a little older and more settled, and suddenly I have a regular paycheck coming in with benefits. I had insurance, and I had days off that were paid, which ultimately allowed me to still go out and I went out with Sawyer Brown a few times and subbed for them, and but it was really funny. They've since built a big mass communication building, but at that time they were teaching all of their TV classes in the studio I was overseeing, and one of the teachers came in and he didn't have another person to run the third camera, and he said, Pat, go out there and grab camera number 1 and run it for me, would you? And I said, okay. I'd never run a studio camera in my life. I did a country music show here in town that I was the music director of, Big Dan Starr. Anybody remember Big Dan? That's a whole nother story. But so I knew a little about how that, and there were a lot of similarities to a recording studio. So I went out and I'm standing before we got going, and I found out where the zoom was. I found out where the focus was, and I found out how to tilt it and all this stuff. And they never noticed. So, hey.
Well, how long did you work at MTSU?
31 years. I can't believe it. Really, a musician holding a job that long? Well, I didn't think I was going to stay. Sounded like a good idea at the time.
So what I hear you saying repeatedly is that you said yes, and that opened a lot of doors for you, that you were just willing to say, I don't know how to do it, but I do. Oh, sure.
Yeah. Just don't tell them.
Just say yes and go forward and do it
Don't ask,
anyway.
don't tell. That's right.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, well, and it worked. If you're semi-intelligent, you can do that. And I guarantee you, almost every musician has had to have a day job part-time at other times, because especially in the wintertime, things get very lean. I remember one time when I was still living here, JR had a friend who had a dairy farm. He needed somebody to paint the inside of his dairy barn. Has anybody ever done that? That was the nastiest thing I ever had to do in my life, because you had to go in there and scrape cow poop off the walls and paint, and I'm thinking, hey, I'm a musician. What am I doing? Oh yeah, they're paying me pretty well to do this. So as a musician, I was one of those guys. All my musician friends in Nashville said, "Man, you got the perfect musician gig," because it allowed me to, when somebody wanted me to go out on the road with them for a week, I could.
Well, what were your expectations at MTSU as far as what you were required to do there?
What were my expectations or
Theirs.
theirs? Just to basically run the department.
But you also recorded all the sports programs?
Well, that was a side gig.
Oh,
That was a side gig.
I can do that, huh?
Well, they called me and they said they were still on film. They did all of their coaches' stuff on film. I'd never run a film camera in my life. And he said, he called the quarterback's coach was was in charge of the film, and he called me up and he said, I need somebody our longtime film guy just quit. He said, I need somebody to shoot film. So I checked around with some of my students and people that worked there. Nobody had done film, and they weren't interested in it. So I called him back, and I said, I'll do it. So I said, can I come and get the camera before the first game? And he said, sure. So I learned how to load the camera, and so I went out on the road with the football team. Then I went out on the road with the basketball team. At first, I was supposed to just be the guy that hosted it. We co-produced it, and I directed it in the studio. But then I had a grad student that was going out shooting it, but then he left. And so I said, here we go. So that's how I did that. I did that for 10 years.
And that was extra money beyond your
Extra
salary.
money, yeah.
Beyond your salary and your insurance and your everything that you got. That's great.
Trust me, my salary was not anything to write home about. But for a musician, having a steady income coming in that you knew, and we only got paid once a month. I remember coming home about the third week in the month, and I'd always tell my wife, I say, only necessities. We're about out of money. And she didn't, I'm not going to say that. I was going to, she apparently didn't understand the word necessities, and so she would find a lamp on sale or a rug on sale, and I said, we can't eat that. So that's why I took the athletics gig. Plus, I like football.
Did you work 12 months?
Oh, yeah. I was on a 12-month contract.
So some of the people at the university don't work summers, but you worked year-round.
It's you faculty people that don't.
Oh, well, sorry. So I know that you continued recording and playing in Nashville. So who did you play with there?
Well, I went out, like I said, a few times with Billy. I went out a few times with Sawyer Brown. And Bobby, after he left Sawyer Brown, he played with, who was it, 38? No, it wasn't 38 Special. It was one of those southern rock bands for several years. And then he moved down to Florida, and he's running a kind of a Branson-esque sort of show down there in Central Florida. And I was telling you about this afternoon. And on Thursday night, they have everybody in Central Florida who thinks they can sing show up to sing at this show. And the steel player's the band leader, so he writes all the charts. We don't ever rehearse with him. And we've written the charts to the tape they've sent us. And these are not professionals. They don't understand that they get to the end. Our chart has ended. And they gave me the heads up. They said, just because the chart says we're done, don't necessarily think that's the case. And so we did that, and that was kind of fun. And then the next night, they had sometimes a name act. They had a Journey tribute band the next night. We opened up and did a half hour or so. Then we got to watch the show. And I have to tell you this. This is funny. Bobby told me that the owner of the place, because one of the first things he asked me, he said, "Pat, you want to move to Florida?" And I said, "No," because I was happy. I was towards the end of my career at the university, and so no, I was actually already retired, I think, when that happened. But the bass player that I was subbing for that weekend apparently had a bit of an anger problem. And the keyboard player was absolutely a pain. And so what happened was apparently they got into it at a rehearsal. And the bass player headbutted this guy in the stomach. And so Bobby said, "You need to take a break." But the owner wanted to hire me. And Bobby said, "Well, I really feel bad for this guy." So.
Well, I don't want to leave out Supe.
Supe, yeah.
We're almost out of time for getting ready for questions from the audience, so be thinking about what you'd like to ask Pat. But I would like to hear you talk a little bit about what you did with Supe and the Sandwiches. And
I've been a part-time sandwich. It's any of you who know Supe, he's a hoot, and we had a great time. It's really funny because we used to see each other more here. I would go out and sit in with Bo and the boys, and Supe. I'd see Supe there a lot. And we finally realized we just lived down the road from one another. Let's get together and play some music. So we started doing that, and that's where I met the guy from Dylan's band. And then right before COVID, there was the guitar player had a studio right over on the Cumberland River, and so we would go over there about 2 Tuesdays a month in the morning at about 10 a.m., and we would just get in a big circle in that studio, And it was just a bunch of old men sitting in a circle, grinning from ear to ear, because everybody in the group was a professional. We understood dynamics. Those of you who've played for a long time, you know, most of us, especially us rock and rollers, didn't really know what dynamics were. You know, it was balls to the wall, no matter what. The louder you can play, the better. So, but we had so much fun doing that. You know, we would sometimes the drummer from Poco was playing with us there, and sometimes he wouldn't show up. And then Delbert McClinton's drummer came in one week and played with us. So, playing with that level of players was such a joy. And then I also played my upright I played some silly grandpa gigs with Supe. He played a bunch of children's shows, and so, yeah, we had fun.
I know there's no one in here that doesn't know who Supe is, but he's a bass player for the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. I'm sure you all know that. Really
and Supe's not his real name.
Yeah, Michael Granda. So, how about some questions for Pat? Yes, Elliot.
What is your worst nightmare?
Oh my! How do I count them? Oh, I remember when I was playing with Don King, and it was right around the time of the urban cowboy stuff, and I think we were in Texas, and we were nothing but a country pop band, a bunch of long-haired guys coming in and playing. It was a good band. It really was a good band, but we played this place. It was a show, but it was in a bar. And it was kind of a biker bar sort of thing. And so we're playing our regular show, all Don's originals. And these guys were getting angry. They wanted us to play something they could dance to. This was not a dance, but, they wanted, and they were coming up and this was when I wish we had chicken wire, but we didn't. But they came up and they were pounding on the stage. And Bobby and I both were old country guys. We knew a bunch of old country songs, and we said, Don, let me do Miles and Miles of Texas. And he said, nope, sticking to the show. I thought we were going to die before we got out there. We had to do a second show, and the club owner came back to our dressing room, and he said, listen, guys, I think we're going to probably pass on the second show. And, I breathed a big sigh of relief. And Don's dad, who was our manager, he said, oh, no, we have a contract. We're going to play the second show. And he just looked at him and said, you'll get paid. He said, oh, okay. But I truly was scared for my life that night because they were getting angry. And I almost turned to Bobby and told he was playing steel guitar and almost turned to him and said, kick something off. But we survived.
Other question? Yes.
I live about 25 miles south of Nashville in Murfreesboro, which is where Middle Tennessee State is. I was never a real city dweller, so when I first moved there, I lived in Franklin, which is just out kind of the other way from Murfreesboro. It's still south, but it's more, what would that be, southwest. So I am married to a lovely woman who we, between us, have 3 children, all grown. She has 3 grandchildren. I don't have any. So I do claim them. We have a great 17-year-old who reminds me a lot of myself. He's really belligerent sometimes, but he's a nice kid, But and we my wife she's semi-retired from real estate, and so we live a pretty simple, quiet life. I did do some producing when I retired. A songwriter friend of mine. And that was fun for me to see that I could still do that. I wrote all the charts and arranged things, and then I played with the band, and I hired some great players. And we got some wonderful tracks. He called me up and said, I want to go in the studio and do about 10 or 15 sides. I said, okay. So we did. He starts emailing me these guitar vocal demos so I could write the charts. And before we finished, we did 35 sides. We were in the studio for weeks. And that was fun. I mean, it was fun for me after not having done it full time for a while, to find out I could still do it.
You got to talk about your daughter.
My daughter, she first of all, she's a great, she came from two musicians. Her mom's a classical violinist, and so she's always had a good ear. Some people, I've always been amazed by this, because when we grew up, our mom was, she could play all these old honky-tonk songs. And when I was learning how to play guitar, she would be playing. And I said, "What key are you in?" She said, "I don't know." And so she did that. But what was funny, I don't know if I've ever even told you this, when my dad died, we're walking away from the gravesite, and his sister said, "Oh, I used to love to hear your father sing." And I stopped in my tracks, and I said, "What? Did you ever hear him sing?" "Nope. I didn't know he could sing." But apparently he could. So I always figured anything I had came from my family side. As a matter of fact, I was telling Kitty this, that our mom grew up around Mountain View, which Randall Chowning's mom and her were like buddies in high school. So it's a small world. But
More questions? Yes, Jr.
Pat, tell us about Owl's Hoot.
Owl's Hoot.
And the concert you guys played.
Okay. As some of you, the 70s are still a little hazy at times. Somehow, right after Randall and Buddy left the Daredevils, I found myself in a studio. One of their friends had a little studio, and it was me and Randall, Buddy, Rick Davison, Lumpy, everybody used to call him, and Donnie Thompson. And we started just getting together and we did some originals, and we were doing some kind of obscure songs. We really had no purpose. I don't remember of a purpose. As I said, it's still a little hazy. And Tim Burrows called me up one day, and he said, "The Amazing Rhythm Aces are coming to play at McDonald Arena. You guys want to open for them?" And, I talked to the guys, and they said, "Sure, why not?" He was going to pay us, and, we got a paying gig. So Dean Billingsley, I'd forgotten that about the Owl's Hoot. Dean Billingsley named it, because we said, "What are we going to call this, this troop of guys?" And so Dean said, "How about Owl's Hoot?" We went, "What?" If you know Dean Billingsley, you know that was not unusual, something like that to come out of his mouth. I don't know if any of you had the pleasure of going out and playing on Dean's yard back in the 60s. But his studio too. But we would set up out in the yard. I'm sure you did that too, didn't you, Chris?
My first record I did after
Well, and he recorded Owl's Hoot. But when he had the fire, he lost it. Because it was a pretty good little band. We rehearsed quite a bit, but we played one show. And then after that, it was no more. So it was fun.
Well, our time is about up. Anybody have any burning desires to say something? If not, we will say thank you very much, Pat Jackson, for sharing your story with Music Monday of the Ozarks. And we really appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.